Thank you so much for coming to the second lecture of the World Affairs Council Great Decision Series 2008. My name is Ping Liang. I'm the board president, and I'm so delighted all of you come despite the Arctic weather here. Tonight's lecture is China's economic rise, challenges and opportunities for the United States. China today appears to be a nation of contrast. Is China communist or capitalist? Is it a partner or a competitor? Is a follower or is a leader? Rich or poor? Imitator or innovator? Friend or future foe? Our speaker this evening, Dr. Nicholas Lardy, will help us clarify and understand this contrast and more. Dr. Lardy is one of the world's leading experts on China and China's role in the world economy. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. The Institute is the only major research center in the United States devoted to global economic policy and the best of its kind in the world. So we are very delighted to have Dr. Lardy here today. He's the author of numerous books and articles on the Chinese economy. One of his most recent books, published in 2006, written with several other co-authors, is China, the Balance Sheet. And it's a wonderful book, so I highly recommend that if you can get a chance to read it. Dr. Lardy was with the Brookings Institution before joining the Institute for International Economics in 2003. He has also taught at Yale University and the University of Washington. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Lardy received his BA from University of Wisconsin and his PhD from U of M, University of Michigan. So we're very happy to have him back here with us. And for me, it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce a professor I took international finance at Yale many, many years ago here to Grand Rapids. So let me introduce Dr. Lardy to all of you. Dr. Lardy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ping. When I was first invited to come and talk about the Chinese economy and challenges and opportunities for the United States, I thought, oh, I've been selected because they think I know something about China, but it's only more recently I realized they checked out my background and found out I'd lived in Madison, Wisconsin, and grew up in the Midwest and went to school here, and I wouldn't be deterred by adverse weather that might appear here at this time of the year. So I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to talk to you this evening about, as Ping said, the rise of China and its implications for the United States in particular. I want to just start out by sketching out the rise of the Chinese economy, what it has meant for its global footprint, and try to briefly answer the question whether or not this growth that we've seen in the recent decades is sustainable. In other words, is China going to continue to be an increasingly important factor in the global economy? And then turn to look at three specific issues in the relationship between China and the United States, three economic issues. Two very closely related, obviously, the trade deficit and China's currency policy. And then I'll close with saying something about food safety, which has been such a very important issue starting last year for consumers in the United States. But I think we all know that China's been growing very, very rapidly now for 3 decades. Reforms began in the late 1970s. China's economic growth has expanded its economy dramatically. It's been growing at about 10% per year. It's the fastest growing economy in the world over the last 30 years. It's now the 4th largest economy. But as Ping suggested, it is a question, is it rich or is it poor? It is huge in terms of its economic size, but of course it has the world's biggest population as well. And that means in per capita terms, China is still relatively poor. If you take last year's output and divide it by the 1.3 billion population and convert it into dollars at market exchange rates, we're talking about a per capita income of only $2,500. So the paradox is that China is a giant in terms of its total size, and as I'll explain in a minute, in terms of its global footprint, but in per capita terms, it is relatively poor. And this does cause some problems, I would say, in terms of what our expectations are of China as a nation, and also what China's views are about what it can do. And we had introduced into the discussion a few years ago by Robert Zellick this concept that China should be a responsible stakeholder in the global system, that it should play a positive role in terms of its participation in international organizations, abiding by international norms and conventions and so forth. And I think at sometimes that is, and he said the reason for this, of course, was you're one of the biggest economies in the world, you should play by the rules, you benefit from the rules and so forth. And I think the Chinese do take that to heart, but at some times China sees itself more as a third world country with a relatively low per capita income and a country that's not always able to meet the same standards as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other advanced industrial economies that have per capita incomes that are 10, 20 times more than they do. So I think this will continue to be an ongoing tension between whether or not China is thought of as a relatively huge economic powerhouse or a poor third world country, and it is, in fact, both. And I think that's an important thing always to keep in mind. Now let me talk about the global footprint that I said I would address. China's global trade last year was 2.2 trillion US dollars. You won't remember that number for very long, but maybe you'll remember that it is 100 times what their trade was in 1978. When the reform began in China, China was very inward-looking, very autarkic, self-sufficient, particularly in the Maoist Cultural Revolution decade from 66 into the mid-70s. Self-sufficiency was the order of the day, and China was simply almost invisible in terms of world trade. It is now the third largest trading economy on the globe. Last year, it actually exported more goods than the United States. The only country that exports more than China today is Germany. The only country that imports more is the United States. Of course, we're great on importing. In other words, it is a big, big player and has a huge global footprint in terms of the flow of goods in the global economy. It also, I think we're increasingly aware, has a very large footprint in terms of international finance. It has been welcoming foreign direct investment. It has a cumulative amount of foreign direct investment that is much greater than any other emerging market. And China has now also begun to invest outwardly, investing abroad in oil resources, other kinds of natural resources, iron ore deposits, oil and gas, and so forth, and even buying some iconic foreign brands, as it did a couple of years ago when it bought the PC business from IBM, the so-called ThinkPad brand, and has entered into the global computer business on the basis of that. This is the Chinese company Lenovo, and more recently, China's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the China Investment Corporation, has begun to make significant investments abroad, taking big stakes in the likes of Morgan Stanley, the U.S. Investment Bank, and some other, the Blackstone Group, and other things. This, of course, is a function of the fact that China now has far away the largest foreign exchange reserves of any country, 1.53 trillion US dollars at the end of last year, and growing by $400 to $500 billion a year. So there's no question this is an economy that has grown extremely rapidly, and also one that has become very important globally, whether you're thinking in terms of trade flows or whether you're thinking of international financial markets. Now, let me turn, as I said, what explains why China has done so well, and what's the implication of my explanation? Does this mean that's going to peter out sometime soon or slow down dramatically, or is the story likely to continue? There are many, many ways of looking at the factors that underlie Chinese economic growth, and I just want to highlight three that I think are particularly important. And I think of these, I would place first the fact that China has become, I would argue, a market economy. Many people forget that at the beginning of economic reform, when I first went to China in 1978, the most striking thing about China at that time is basically there were almost no markets for anything. There were little vegetable markets where you could buy products produced very nearby. There was no long-distance transportation of fruit and vegetables. So if you were in North China at the beginning of the winter, you could buy white cabbage and white cabbage and white cabbage and absolutely nothing else. You wouldn't see an orange or a piece of fruit even in the few hotels that then existed to serve foreigners. People also forget, at that time, China had rationing of the most basic commodities. If you lived in a city and you wanted to buy grain, you had to get a grain coupon from your work unit. If you wanted to buy clothing or cloth to make clothing, everything having anything to do with cotton was rationed, and you were given a coupon to get a very, very limited amount of cotton per year. Even such things as vegetable oil, which we all know are essential for Chinese cooking, was rationed. And at one time, I think I figured out, the ration worked out to about a half a teaspoon of oil per person per month or something. It was just a teeny amount. And when family members visited Chinese from abroad, they were carrying with them big bottles of cooking oil because you couldn't get it in China. Or if you didn't bring it in with you, you went to the friendship store where foreign passport holders could buy extra amounts of vegetable oil to give to their family members. And if you move to the industrial sector, the machinery, all the investment goods were allocated by a central bureaucracy at prices that were fixed artificially. And all of that now is gone. China basically is a market economy. It has dynamic markets for products. It also has a labor for market today. Remember, in the 70s, whenever you finished school, you were assigned a job, and most people stayed in that job their entire careers. It didn't matter whether you had a high school degree or a middle school degree or a college degree. There was no labor market, and there was very little labor turnover. Today, you finish your schooling at whatever level, you have to find a job for yourself. If you don't like it, you can quit. If they don't like you, they can fire you. And there's a lot of labor turnover, and there's much more wage variation, and I think people are getting allocated much more efficiently. So the rise of the market, I think, is probably the single most important factor underlying the transformation of this economy. A second factor is the fact that China has a very high national savings rate. It's not just that the households save a lot, but the government actually saves. They take more money in taxes than they spend on providing services, and that means the government can build a lot of infrastructure. So they have a very high savings rate. In fact, they have far and away the highest savings rate of any country in the world. It's about twice the savings rate of India. It's several times the savings rate in the United States. Just the most striking comparison, of course, is that Chinese households, on average, save about 25% of their after-tax income. And of course, in the United States, in many recent years, our household savings rate has actually been negative. That is, enough of us are spending more than our incomes by running up our credit card debt or using home equity lines of credit or whatever else is available, that we spend more, as a society, households spend more than their income, and there's a negative contribution. This is critical, obviously, because this high rate of savings allows you to have a high rate of investment, and investment is the cornerstone of economic growth everywhere, so countries that invest more generally tend to grow more rapidly. So it's the rise of the market, number one, the high savings, number two, and the third factor, and it ties closely back into the first one, is that this economy is fairly open to the outside world. And the openness is very important because it makes the market economy a competitive market economy, and competition drives productivity growth everywhere. Well, why do I say it's open? First of all, in the manufacturing sector, which is very important in China, about about a third of all manufactured goods now are actually made by foreign companies that have gone to China, set up joint ventures, or wholly foreign-owned companies. This is a remarkably high share. In other words, foreigners are very, very active in the domestic economy. If you take the EU as a whole, where they've been promoting cross-border flows of capital and mergers and acquisitions really since the 1950s, only about 25% on average of manufacturing output in EU countries is made by companies that have their headquarters in some other country. So China is ahead of the EU. Is ahead of the United States. In the United States, about 20% of our manufacturing output is made by foreign-owned companies. You go to Japan, it's less than 1%. They never allowed foreigners to come in very much, and foreigners don't add to the competitive mix. India is the same. It's about 1%. So the openness of the economy to foreign participation in the form of investment means that domestic firms have to face competition not just from goods produced abroad and then imported, but also goods produced by foreign firms in China, and they presumably bring with them the best technology, management, and so forth that is available so that they will be successful. Another indication of how open is China is that imports now are equal to about 35% of GDP. This is a very, very high degree of openness. As I mentioned before, in the United States, we know we have a big deficit globally in our trade. We are really great at importing because we love those foreign goods so much, whether it's cars or consumer electronics or whatever. China's ratio of imports to GDP is twice what it is in the U.S. In the U.S., we're at about 17%. China's about 35%. And that makes China a very, very competitive market because if you're an indigenous firm, you have to be able to compete with imports coming in at relatively low tariffs, I should add, particularly since China came into the WTO. Their average tariffs are now under 10% compared to 27% in India. You have to compete with those imports if you're an indigenous company, but you not only have to compete with the imports, you have to compete with the foreign companies that have come in and set up factories within your own economy and that are producing about 30% of all the manufactured goods that are available in the market. So it's this combination I think is very powerful. The market, competition from openness, and the high savings, which allows a high investment rate. And without going into the details, I would say these very important factors are likely to persist, not indefinitely, but at least for another decade or so. And I think that means that China's rapid rise, is likely to continue for at least another decade. That doesn't mean it will be continuously 11 point whatever percent. It may go up and it may go down a little bit. But on average, their growth rate compared to the global economy, I think, is likely to be fairly rapid. There are many, many, of course, domestic challenges that China faces. I don't have time to go into them in my remarks. There's very rapid urbanization, which is creating challenges. They have rapidly increasing inequality, which is creating challenges. They have environmental deterioration, shortages of water, and all kinds of other things that could slow them down. But I think they will work their way around those constraints. So I think the rise of China is likely to be a story that will be with us for a while. It is not going to fade away, at least for the next 10 years or so. Now, let me turn, before I talk about the three issues I said I'd say something about from the U.S. perspective, let me just turn to the global perspective. How does China affect the rise of the global economy? And I think it's a complicated story, but it's the one the framework I would like to take. You'll probably all immediately go to sleep, but it's I'm an economist, so I can be pretty boring. I think the main way of thinking about the rise of China is the impact that it has on global prices. As I say, that sounds fairly esoteric, but what I want to suggest is that China's effect on the global economy is transmitted primarily through prices, and just let me sketch out a couple of examples. In terms of global commodity prices, the price of oil and iron ore and so forth, China is pushing prices relentlessly upward. If you look at the data, you will find that even though China only is consuming about 5% of global oil, 5% of oil produced globally is consumed in China. If you look at the increase in the demand for oil over the last 5 years, China accounts for 30% of the increase. So to the extent to which we believe that the big oil price increases of recent years are a function of rising demand relative to supply, China has been the single most important player. They're accounting for 1/3 of the increased demand globally for oil, even though their share of the total market is relatively small. It's the incremental demand that is driving the price of oil. And you can say the same thing for a lot of other commodities, whether it's iron ore or other commodities. For commodities like steel, copper, and nickel, China's actually accounted for 95% of the increase in global demand over the last 5 years. So if you're in a resource-rich economy like Brazil with a lot of iron ore, those economies have gotten a tremendous boost from the rise of China. Australia is obviously another very good example with its mineral wealth. On the other hand, those economies like the United States, it's very dependent on imported oil. We have certainly suffered from this because China has driven up prices more than they would have. So the first big effect then is on the commodity prices, and China has generally been pushing prices up. But the story is exactly the opposite when you start looking at finished goods. When you go to buy things at Circuit City or any of the other mass merchandisers of consumer electronics, we know the prices of those things are they've been coming down for several years, and China's a major factor. Taiwanese factories producing in China today account for about 90% of the world's output of notebook computers. They're being produced in China. The price is on average going down a few percentage points every year, so the PCs, or the notebook computers in particular that we buy today, are not only cheaper than the ones we bought 5 years ago, but they have greater capacity by whatever metric you think is important. This is what some people call the China price or the Walmart price. So China is a big supplier of finished goods, whether it's the traditional things like apparel and footwear, or the consumer electronics, the iPods that are all made in China, and the notebook computers and so forth. Those are goods in which China's effect on the global economy is deflationary. Prices are coming down, and of course all of us as consumers benefit from the availability of these goods. We're paying more at the pump for the oil because China's pushing that price up, but we're paying less for the consumer electronics. Now, the third very important price that China has some influence on is wages. We cannot quantify it easily, but I don't think there's any doubt that the entry of hundreds of millions of additional workers into the global labor market has had an effect on wages. China is relatively, as I've already indicated, particularly if you flash back 20 years or even 10 years, China's wages were even lower. China has actually provided then huge pools of low-wage labor that have entered into the global market by virtue of the fact that China's become a big exporter of so many manufactured goods. And I think that has put downward pressure on wages, even in countries like the United States, where hourly production workers have had real wages that have been basically stagnant now for a couple of decades, if not even a little bit longer. China's been an important part of that story. India increasingly is also contributing to that story. But I think that's another important element when we look at the rise of China, is that it in effect means that there are a lot of new workers that weren't participating in the global economy who are now participating. They're producing goods that are relatively inexpensive, and the availability of those goods puts downward pressure on wages, particularly for hourly production workers in manufacturing in the United States. Now, it's not the only factor. Technology change is very, very important. It's very hard to separate out the influence of the global trade on the one hand and changes in technology on the other, but I think it's a factor. China, obviously, I think also has contributed to the fact that in the United States in recent years, we've seen a rise in the profit share of GDP at the expense of wages. Actually, the same thing has been happening in China. The profit share has been going up, and the share of wages in China's own GDP has been going down. That has contributed to rising income inequality in the United States and in China as well, with all of the problems that poses. So I think if you think about the big structural questions about the rise of China, it is worth thinking in terms of big effect upward on commodity prices, big effect downward on a lot of finished goods, deflationary on that front, and probably also some downward pressure on the wages of hourly production workers. So in balance, how you feel about the rise of China as a huge, big player in the global economy depends a lot on where you are, what country you're in, what business you're in, which sector of the economy you're in. Obviously, consumers are benefiting. Many countries are benefiting from China's huge imports, particularly of raw materials, but also agricultural products, which I'll mention when we start talking about the U.S. So I think that's the framework in which to see China. It's a complicated story. Some people always talk about how China's pushing prices up. Other people talk about how China's pushing prices down. It's doing both. It's just different kinds of commodities that are moving in different directions. Now let me turn in the remaining time to talk about more explicitly about the United States and our economic relationship with China, the currency, the trade deficit, and then finally something about food safety. Well, I think it's important to recognize when we talk about imbalances, we know we have a big deficit with China. It was about $230 billion in 2006. The final numbers won't be out for another few days for 2007, but it's going to be something maybe $30 billion higher in 2007. So it's a very substantial portion of our total global deficit that we have in the United States. But I think it's important to put things in context and to say basically, to a certain extent, the United States and China are mirror images of one another. Because after all, global imbalances ultimately are a reflection of saving investment imbalances. And in other words, if you have more savings than investment, that means you're going to be a capital exporter and you're going to be running a trade surplus like China. If your savings is much less than your investment like the United States, you have to borrow abroad to finance your investment, and you're going to be running a trade deficit. So China, as I've already mentioned, has the highest rate of national savings, and the United States has one of the lowest rates of national savings. China has the world's biggest global current account surplus. That is, they're selling more into the international market than they're buying, and we have the world's biggest global current account deficit. That is, we are buying more from the rest of the world than we're selling to the rest of the world. So ultimately, to rectify these imbalances, we need to change the savings and investment behavior. China needs to encourage more consumption and less savings. And in the United States, we need to do the opposite. We need to have more savings and less consumption. Now, not very many people less, but I think we're moving in that direction, in part as a result of correction in housing prices and so forth. I think we will see a rise in the savings rate in the United States. Indeed, we have begun to see in the United States a slowdown in external deficit, and it's actually shrunk about $100 billion in real terms over the last year. So there needs to be adjustment, and I think exchange rate adjustment is a very important part of that. I've been writing about the Chinese undervalued currency since 2003 and continue to write about it. I think the Chinese currency is undervalued, and faster appreciation is one of the mechanisms that will help to bring about these underlying changes that are necessary in savings and investment behavior in China that will help China make a contribution to to reducing global economic imbalances. And the fact of the matter is today, our role in global economic imbalances has begun to shrink over the last year and a half, and China's is still growing very, very rapidly. So there's not a one-to-one link between China and the United States on this front, but China could be doing more, and if it would do more, it would contribute to us bringing down our large global deficit. Why do we care about doing that? Well, essentially we care about doing it because the longer we run a global deficit, the more we owe the rest of the world. And we now have a net international investment position, which is extremely unfavorable and one that's growing rapidly. And of course, eventually we'll have to bring that down, or the rest of the world, or we'll have to see a slower pace of increase, or the rest of the world will start charging us higher interest rates in order to lend to us as they view us as less and less credit worthy. Let me just say 2 or 3 more things about China and the trade imbalance. Part of the imbalance arises because a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing has moved from elsewhere in Asia to China. I mentioned the laptop computers that used to be made overwhelmingly in Taiwan by Taiwanese companies. Now they're made almost exclusively, indeed I think by now they are only made in China. And China is the source of 90% of the world's notebook computers. Most of the profits, however, go to the Taiwanese companies that organize the production in China, although as we measure these things conventionally, it is counted as an export from China. The other thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, is that China is a very rapidly growing importer, and the United States has benefited substantially from China's rise in terms of its global trade situation. Our exports to China over the last 5 years have actually grown much, much more rapidly to China than any other significant trading partner in the world. Over the last 5 years, our exports to China, that is the exports of U.S. firms to China, have almost tripled. They're up 260%. If you look at our trade to all of the rest of the world combined, that is everybody but China, in the same time period, our trade is up by only about 30%. The world up 30%, exports to China up almost 300%. So it's actually close to quadrupling. If you take some major trade partners who used to be important, like Japan, our exports to Japan in the last 5 years are not only growing slowly, they've actually shrunk. So as Japan's economic growth has slowed down visibly over the last decade or longer, it has become a much less important market for U.S. firms than in the recent past. And China, in other words, China is the big new growth area. What is China buying from the United States? Last year, they bought about $6 billion worth of semiconductors, which is about 10 times more than we exported to China in the year 2000. They bought over $6 billion worth of aircraft, which is about 4 times what they bought in the year 2000. Farmers produced $3.1 billion worth of soybeans that were sold to China last year. That's 3 times more than China purchased in 2000. Cotton, $1.4 billion, about 30 times more than China bought in the year 2000. So we do have strength in our exports to China, and it is a trade relationship I think we have unbalanced gain from, but I do think China does need to allow its currency to appreciate. It does need to reduce its larger huge global trade surplus, just as we need to reduce our large global deficit. So complicated trading relationship, but one on which on balance I think we've benefited from. Now let me turn finally, before we turn to questions, about food and product safety, which became such a well-covered issue in the United States in 2007. It started with pet food and seemed a little odd, and then it went on to fish and toothpaste and toys and a whole range of goods that were coming from China that were found to be flawed. They had lead paint or bad designs or had contamination of one sort or another. I will tell you my view on this. I think the ultimately food safety and product safety in the United States is a shared responsibility, I would say, between the producers and the government in China, the importers and the sellers of those products in the United States, and thirdly, the U.S. government. And I think that's the right way to look at it. And I think in general, importers and sellers in the United States have recognized their responsibility. Mattel, for example, has apologized for selling faulty products. They admitted that in several products the problems arose because of design flaws, and they also recognize that in certain other products, particularly in the lead paint cases, the problems arose because they did not sufficiently inspect and supervise their subcontractors. The product specification was for standards that would meet safety requirements in the United States, but there was inadequate enforcement, and the things were being produced in factories that Mattel did not own, and they weren't inspecting the subcontractors, and things went off the wires, off the track. The United States government, and China has stepped up a little bit to its responsibility. It has passed a number of new laws, created task forces and so forth and are doing more. The United States government has signed some agreements with China, particularly the Department of Health and Human Services has signed agreements in which the Chinese government has agreed to take the responsibility for enforcing standards that are set in the United States, both for food and for product safety. The problem, I think, is that China has limited capacity to enforce these standards. And just to put my bottom line out, I don't think we can really rely on a country that has limited capacity and a per capita income of $2,500 to enforce safety standards that are adequate for consumers in the United States. So it's good to sign bilateral agreements with Chinese agencies, but they have very limited capacity. The numbers of firms involved is staggering. There are something like 450,000 firms in China alone that produce food, not counting toys and other kinds of products. The State Food and Drug Administration, which is a Chinese entity, has very limited inspection capacity and limited authority. And so my view is we can't rely entirely on a country that has low capacity to enforce our standards. And I think we'll have to do more domestically in the United States. The current administration has been relentlessly against any increase in inspection in the U.S. The view of the administration is we cannot inspect our way out of this problem. Well, but we know, for example, that only 1% of the food imported into the United States is inspected. Some of it comes into ports where there aren't even any inspectors. So I think that's a problem. But the Bush administration is not asking for any increase in the budget for the Food and Drug Administration. And even the Food and Drug Administration says, yes, it might be nice to have some inspectors in China. They don't have any there now, and they've not even asked for a budget increase so that they could do it. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, I think, is even a worse example. They have very limited authority. Even before you correct for inflation, their budget today is less than half of what it was in 1974 when the Consumer Product Safety Commission was first created. So I think my view is that over time, the Chinese will develop the capacity to carry out inspections, enforce standards that would be appropriate for the sale of products in our market. But I think in the short and medium term, to assure safety in the United States, we need stronger inspection, we need stronger enforcement in the United States, and we can't just kind of push the whole thing over back to the Chinese and say, you have to make sure that all the products coming into our country meet our standards. I think it has to be a more robust, diverse effort involving the United States government as well as the Chinese government. Well, let me just give you a few conclusions. I think China has had a very extraordinarily rapid long-run economic growth, but remember, by our standards, it's still relatively poor in per capita terms at only about $2,500. The underlying sources of China's economic growth, I think, are very straightforward. The rise of the market, the openness to the rest of the world, high savings and investment. And if you look at the factors that have created, the underlying factors that have contributed to those things, I think they will persist, and I think that means that China is likely to continue to do reasonably well economically. It doesn't mean they'll have very high growth every single year, but over time, they're likely to continue to do much, much better than the global average. And as a result of that, their global footprint will continue to increase. They will continue to provide challenges and opportunities of the type that I've alluded to this afternoon. Their influence on the global economy is very, very substantial, and I haven't even talked about some of the most important things: global warming. China's now the biggest emitter of carbon of any country in the world. It's going to go up substantially over the near and medium term, but they are continuing to be a big contributor to upward prices on commodities like petroleum, natural gas, iron ore, copper, and so forth. I think they will continue to be relatively deflationary on the prices of many finished goods, and I think they will continue to exert some downward pressure on hourly wages for production workers. I'd remind you that our trade deficit globally is primarily a function of our very low rate of national savings, and it's within our ability to reduce our deficit if we increase our savings rate. China certainly should be making a contribution to that, however, by allowing its currency to appreciate more rapidly, bringing down China's own large external surplus, which would contribute to a reduction of these imbalances we see in the global economy. And finally, I would say on the issue of safety that I think we are being very naive in expecting the Chinese government can enforce acceptable levels of food and product safety, that we have to do much more ourselves to ensure that the products that are available to us meet appropriate standards on safety. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. And I'm going to have some help.
Well, you do have some help. In fact, I'll ask the first question, if I may.
Okay.
To a non-economist, when you're talking about undervalued currency and China really ought to do something about it, I don't understand what the incentive is for China, quite frankly. If I were in their shoes and I saw an economy that was growing and I saw a currency that was very strong, I don't know why I would voluntarily take measures to change that.
Okay. Well, that's a very good question, and again, the answer can be a little bit complicated, but I hope I can advance the cause of understanding on this. The main reason China should allow its currency to appreciate more rapidly is for its own domestic interests. When you have a big, big surplus like China does, something on the order of $300 billion on the trade account last year, that means that the country is awash in foreign exchange because manufacturers are earning so much more in selling goods into the rest of the world than are the demand for goods coming into China. If the government does not want the currency to appreciate, so you have a big excess supply of foreign exchange, the price would go down, which means the domestic currency is going up. But the government doesn't want the domestic currency to go up, so what do? They step into the market, they intervene, and they buy up the excess foreign exchange. We always talk about buying up foreign exchange. Well, how do you buy foreign exchange? You sell domestic currency. I mean, it's just two different ways of describing the same transaction. So the government, to keep this exchange rate changed, is selling huge amounts of its own domestic currency into the market. That creates the potential for inflation because money supply then is growing so rapidly. Now, they try to deal with that through a process that economists call sterilization. They sell all this domestic currency into the market, and then they issue bonds to try to get the money back out of circulation. It's a very convoluted process. I won't go into all the technicalities, but most economists believe it's very difficult to keep this story going for a long period of time, and eventually what will happen is that you'll have a big increase in inflation. And we've seen that over the last year. Consumer prices last year went up by almost 5%. They're still going up on a year-over-year rate of something like 6-7%, so inflation is not coming down. This is a government that is very sensitive to price inflation. They've had two bouts of serious price inflation, one in the 80s and one in the 90s, and most of them still remember that one of the key reasons the Kuomintang government lost popular support in the 40s was the hyperinflation that prevailed at that time, which eroded the value of money. You know, the famous pictures of people going to the store to buy what they called a caddy of rice, which is half a kilogram, a jin of rice, and the money would be in a wheelbarrow, and it was heaping. The money was worthless, and you had to have massive amounts of it to buy even the simplest things. So that was one of the factors that led to the demise of the prevailing government at that time, and this leadership recognizes that this is potentially a very important domestic. So I think for domestic reasons they're worried about inflation and will have to allow the currency to appreciate. So they don't have to intervene so much, flood the market with money.
Okay. We'll start over here.
Thank you so much for coming. I know you described the Chinese economy as a market system, as is ours, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to compare the role of the government in China compared with the role of the government in the United States in influencing the answers to those basic economic questions of what to produce, how, and who gets it.
Well, you know, judging the extent to which an economy is a market economy is complicated, and a lot is in the eye of the beholder. But as I indicated, I think if you look at how products are being distributed in China today, it's overwhelmingly through the market. if you look at how prices are being set, it's overwhelmingly by the market. Even some of the prices that Chinese government is controlling are tied very closely to the international market. For example, the price of crude oil is still fixed by the government. But how do they fix the price? Well, every month they take the average of the price in Singapore and Rotterdam and one other place, divide it, take that average and then add on 5% for transportation costs. That's the price of crude oil in China for the next, until the next time they survey the prices, and they do it fairly often. So even some of the prices that they control are closely tied to international prices. And most of the other prices that they control are prices that governments or regulatory agencies control in many, many countries. Electricity. Well, you have a regulator that decides what the price of electricity is going to be. Or pharmaceuticals. In most countries, the government has a big say over the prices of pharmaceuticals. Not so much in our country, but in many countries, the government has a very strong influence. So on prices, I think the government's role is quite modest. Now, the government still does own a couple of, has a dominant ownership role in a couple of sectors. If you take the overall economy in manufacturing, at the beginning of reform, 80% of everything being produced was coming out of state-owned companies. Today it's down to about 20%. But it is true that government firms dominate in certain very important industries. Telecommunications, for example. Well, they're listed on the stock exchange, and you can even buy some of these shares in Hong Kong, but the government owns most of the shares of China Mobile and China Telecom and companies like that. So to some extent, they're kind of funny hybrids. They're listed, and you can buy the shares, but the government is the dominant owner. The railroads, obviously, still controlled by the government. Electric power generation is still completely controlled by the government. So I would say China is kind of like, we have to think of Britain before Thatcher. Or you have to think of, remember in the 50s in England, it was a market economy. The government owned the coal mines and a number of sectors. Or France, even to the 70s, had significant state ownership of some assets. So China is not, a pure laissez-faire economy, but it's one in which the government ownership role has declined dramatically, and it's kind of where the more socialist countries of Western Europe were 20 to 25 years ago.
Hi. My question, I think, follows up on the question you just answered, and that's about the government role in setting wages. Because one of the things you talked about and is great concern to us in Michigan is the downward pressure on wages as a result of our companies investing in China. And whereas I think in the United States there's been a general downward pressure on wages at the worker level, that has not been accompanied by downward pressure on wages at the executive compensation level in the United States, and that's of concern to many people here. So what I want to know is, in China, is there a minimum wage? What determines worker wages? And is there this sort of similar gap between the wages of the workers and the wages of the executive?
Okay, several dimensions of your question. I would just expand a little bit on what I said earlier, and that is just let me tell you what the old system was. I said in the old system you graduated from whatever you finished your schooling, you were assigned a job. There was a book of wages. If you had a degree in engineering and you worked for 5 years, and you could look up in the book and turn to page 20, whatever it was, everybody who had those characteristics got exactly the same wage. So there was complete government control of the wage system, and the gap between top management and workers was relatively modest. Now basically everything's market determined, and the gap between the top management and the average worker has gone up a lot. It doesn't approach what it is in the United States. So you have market determined. They do have minimum wages. These minimum wages are set almost entirely at the local level. They don't have a national minimum wage. But in Shenzhen, the big manufacturing center in the south, they have a minimum wage. Every major city has a minimum wage. It's in a structure that has been provided for nationally, but it's local decision on what the level should be. In part, that's a function of the fact that prices do vary quite a bit from the coast where they're high to the interior where they're not so high. Now, minimum wages, my impression is that they're important in China, but actually not as important as they might be, because the share of the workers that earn the minimum wage is not very high. The minimum wage is set at something like 30% of that guideline is it's supposed to be something like 30% of the average wage. So the number of people collecting the minimum wage is not so high. So I think they have a very market-determined wage. Now, in terms of the payment of top executives, it has gone up dramatically compared to the pre-reform system in the 70s, the traditional system, but as I said, is nothing like what we have in terms of the gap between, let's say, the average hourly worker and the top executives in most American companies. It's gone up a lot. Income inequality has gone up a lot in China. On some measures now, they have more inequality than we do, because they have a lot of people still in the countryside with very low incomes. And because it is a market economy, it has some of the same characteristics that we do. The demand for skills has gone up, and a limited number of people have the skills, so their wages have gone up a lot, whereas you have a huge migrant population that you read about, particularly in recent weeks when their migrant labor is trying to go back to their home villages. These people get paid very, very little, and in some cases have very low benefits as well. So China has had sharply rising income inequality, particularly over the last decade.
I spent a few months in China over the previous summer on a 3-month study abroad program, and while I was on the ground in China, I started noticing some of these economic issues that are going on. But on the issue of revaluing their currency to put it more in line with where it should be by market standards, while I was in China, anything you could buy at a conventional store that we think of here in the United States with set pricing levels and set currency amounts could be bought on the street at a varying price level that you can negotiate with people for. My real question is, would a revaluation of the currency be able to affect this underground market where you could equally buy any product? And if it can't, then what will a price revaluation of the currency do for us?
Okay. The question is, in some months in China as a student, he noticed that
Let me interrupt you just a second. There's we're having trouble apparently. Let me talk in this microphone. Can you hear okay? Okay. Well, you can't hear the question, so we'll have the speaker repeat the question and then answer the question.
Okay.
Thanks.
The question was, having spent 3 months in China, he observed that in regular stores that have fixed prices where you don't negotiate, they tend to be higher than things you can buy out on the street or in more casual markets, and how would the exchange rate affect that secondary market? Well, I think the main thing to think of is that the exchange rate will not necessarily affect the prices of goods produced in China, sold in China. The main thing appreciation of the exchange rate would do would be to make Chinese goods more expensive outside of China, and would tend to make imported goods coming into China somewhat less expensive. So you could still have this situation where you have some disparities in prices within China for goods produced in China. The exchange rate wouldn't affect those very much, because remember, the production costs are not affected by, measured in terms of domestic currency, are not affected by the value of the currency. If you're making widgets, you're paying your workers in domestic currency, you're buying the electricity in domestic currency and so forth. Where you are affected is if you're selling the widgets outside of China for $1 a unit, and then when you convert back into domestic currency, if the currency is appreciated, you're going to get 70 cents instead of $1, or you're going to get 70 yuan instead of 100 yuan or something like that. So you'll get fewer domestic currency units for every dollar of sales. So the main thing currency change does is to affect the relative prices of goods that you sell outside the country and the relative price of goods produced outside the country that are imported and sold in the country.
Did you say that Taiwanese companies operate in mainland China? I was surprised to hear that because, diplomatically, aren't they somewhat at odds? Is that the same antagonism, not the same in the business community?
Right. The question is, I mentioned Taiwanese companies operating in China, and how do Taiwanese companies operate in China given the historic legacy between China and Taiwan? Well, of course, there is, the Chinese regard the Chinese regard Taiwan as a renegade province. It's an unfinished civil war. the Kuomintang party that lost out to the communists decamped across the straits to take over Taiwan. So politically, there are no diplomatic relations and between the two sides. But the economic ties, quite frankly, could hardly be stronger. Taiwanese businessmen have been probably the biggest single investors in China. It's a little hard to measure because the government has tried to discourage Taiwanese companies from investing offshore, so they set up companies in the British West Indies and certain other places. Look at the numbers from China, and you see that some of the offshore financial centers are some of the biggest investors in China, and most of that is Taiwanese companies that have to set up an entity in a third country, channel the money there, and then go into China. But the consumer electronics area, and particularly IT hardware that I mentioned before, is the best example. Those companies produce 90% of the world's notebook computers, and they closed down their last production line in Taiwan about a year and a half ago. It's all being made in China today. So Taiwanese firms are the single largest foreign investor. Of course, the Chinese don't call them foreign; they put them in a different category. But the third largest, they're the largest non-mainland investors in China, and they're producing very large quantities of export. The scale's unimaginable. There's this company called Hunhai that in one facility in South China, I'm told, I haven't actually seen it myself, 300,000 workers making all kinds of consumer electronics. And it's a company most of us have never heard of. Very, very successful public company traded in Taiwan.
Yeah, China's been signing exclusive agreements with oil-producing states. Do you see that increasing, and how is that going to affect geopolitics going forward if they're signing exclusive agreements and basically circumventing free market for oil?
The question has to do with China's participation in global oil markets, and many Chinese, or at least a few Chinese firms are going abroad and buying up resources, signing exclusive agreements, either getting ownership or exclusive rights to the output. And how does that square with this idea that Chinese companies are market-oriented, and what are the implications for global oil markets? This is a very, very important story, and one that is evolving very, very rapidly. The Chinese, in general, I would say, and it does undermine my story a little bit, they have a couple of ideas. One is that the resources will be more secure if they own them than if they are just buying them. I encountered this when I lived in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s. The first big Chinese investment abroad was to buy timber cutting rights in the Pacific Northwest. So the Chinese bought the right to buy cut down this timber and ship it to China. It didn't make any sense. You can buy as many logs as you want any day of the week, and it's a completely competitive market. And basically, I saw it as a speculation on what the price would be over time. But they have this idea that if you own it, it's more secure, even when there are well-established markets. And so there is an element of irrationality. Anyway, it didn't start on oil. It started when they bought a lot of timber cutting rights. They don't have much phosphate. They need phosphate for fertilizer. They bought a lot of phosphate deposits in Florida back in the 80s. Now they're buying oil, iron ore, and it doesn't make sense it doesn't make complete sense because there are well-established markets for these. You can buy as much as you want. In the worst case situation where there's a war, so they go to war with the let's say they invade Taiwan and we come in on the Taiwanese side and there's a war, well, their oil from anywhere outside of China is going to be cut off immediately by the U.S. Navy. The fact that they own it somewhere else is going to be irrelevant, in my view. But there's still this idea that owning it has certain advantages. It somehow increases security. I don't see it, and I think it's hard to explain. But these companies are driven by this. But on the other hand, they're very profit-oriented. The people that have looked closely, for example, at the oil companies that have bought either exclusive rights or have bought the oil outright, it turns out they sell most of it to third countries. Very little of it comes back to China. So we have this image that they're out there trying to get up all these resources because their own demand for increased oil seems insatiable, but the companies do go out and buy it. Maybe they pay too much on some cases, but when they buy it at a great distance, it turns out often they can sell it to Europe and make more money than shipping it all the way to China and selling it in the domestic market. So there's still a lot of commercial behavior, even in some of these natural resource areas, even if some of the motivation has an element, as I say, that I can't quite explain.
Over here.
I'm presuming that the United States and countries like the United States have some kind of an innovative or technological advantage, and I wanted to know whether China is good at protecting other countries' intellectual property rights. And then on top of that, with regard to foreign direct investment, does China have some kind of policy requiring some kind of technology transfer?
Okay, a two-part question. The first is what's their protection of intellectual property rights, and the second is on
If China has a policy of trying to
forced technology transfer. Okay. Intellectual property has been one of the great sources of friction between China and most of its major trading partners, particularly the United States and also Western Europe. And the short answer is basically China has world-class intellectual property laws, whether you're talking about patents or copyrights or anything. They have also signed up to all of the international conventions that protect intellectual property. The bad news is they don't enforce very many of these laws very often, and so the magnitude of intellectual property theft in China by most measures is huge. And I don't think that situation is going to change for a number of reasons. Local governments don't want to enforce the laws. They are only interested in generating tax revenue, so if the pirates are busy hiring people and then selling stuff, they don't mind. It's great that people in Beijing have signed up for these international standards, but they don't want to hear about them. And the good news, so I started with good news. They've got great laws. Bad news is that they don't enforce them. Coming back, kind of looking forward, one of the things the Chinese did a number of years ago, partly in response to U.S. pressure and other countries, is they set up a whole series of specialized courts for intellectual property protection, where the judges would be more trained in what the laws were. Some of this stuff gets kind of down in the weeds. And now there are thousands and thousands of cases, tens of thousands of cases being presented. And when you look at these cases, we're finding now that in recent years, 95% of the cases are Chinese companies suing other Chinese companies. And I think this is terrific, because this means there are now entrepreneurial, innovative firms in China who, when they find that the guy across the road or in the next province has, reverse engineered their product or somehow violated their intellectual property, they're trying to get redress. So my view is, quite frankly, if it's the foreigner, if it's them versus us, the foreigners versus the Chinese, and the foreigners are trying to get the Chinese to adopt some standard that is created outside without much Chinese participation, it will take forever to make much progress. But when you get Chinese companies demanding protection of their intellectual property, then the whole situation begins to change. So I'm optimistic that in the long run, the situation will improve. We'll get more enforcement. We'll get judgment. Even when you get a judgment, you can't get it carried out. So all of those things should improve over time as there's more demand among Chinese companies and Chinese entrepreneurs for the protection of intellectual property. But in the short run, it's not a good story if you're trying to sell product in China that has a high intellectual property. Now, on the technology transfer issue, this is very complicated, and a lot of assertions are made that the Chinese require the transfer of technology as a condition for certain kinds of transactions or investments. But it's a very complicated situation because making technology available to the Chinese is one of the weapons that foreign firms use when they're competing with each other. And I think, for example, one of the reasons that Boeing has been relatively successful in China is that they've offered China more opportunities for what they call co-production or offsets, where the Chinese when the Boeing says, well, we'll sell you all these planes for this price, but we'll show you how to make the tail assemblies, and we'll buy them from you for all the planes we make and sell globally, and we'll pay you this much, and that'll be an offset for the planes you want to buy from us. And so to compete against Airbus, they've offered more of these. Airbus, has been very hard for Airbus to enter into this because they have this huge complicated thing between the Germans and the French, and they can't decide what kind of production they want to give to the Chinese side because it's all tied up in their internal politics within Airbus. So lots of times technology is transferred as part of a competitive deal. But sometimes critics say, well, the Chinese are forcing Boeing to transfer production technology as a condition for making these big purchases. I think in many cases it's not the case. It's a competitive. Same thing is true in the automobile industry. China's a huge automobile industry now, and some technology obviously has been transferred to China in the joint ventures making automobiles. But in part, it's partly in the interest of the foreign firms. If you want to be successful in China, and your General Motors competing against Toyota and Honda and Nissan, you've got to produce a world-class car in order to sell it in the market, and that inevitably is going to involve the transfer of some technology to your joint venture partner. The question is China's growth hurting us overall? Is it a zero-sum game or not? Well, what I think I was trying to say is I don't think it is a zero-sum game. I think on balance, both sides are gaining through some of the mechanisms that I discussed. I mean, consumers in the U.S. are benefiting from, we haven't made any notebook computers in this country for decades. They're becoming less expensive as we buy them from China as compared to buying them from Taiwan. So we're having a benefit. And obviously, I think some industries in the United States are adversely affected by the fact that China has an undervalued currency, which tends to make its goods more competitive than they would be with an equilibrium exchange rate. And that's something that I think we should continue to press on. But I argue on balance that if you look at it from a national economy point of view, there are still enormous gains from trade. I mentioned some of the products that have had huge gains in sales to China, whether it's semiconductors or soybeans or cotton and so forth. And I think those are general gains from the spread of trade, and China's a big factor. They've gone from being an insignificant player to being the second largest trading economy. And the other thing to keep in mind, remember, is the Europeans are trading with China, the Japanese are trading with China, and they're all gaining from it. And if we pull ourselves out of that, I think we will just lose. Many of the things we sell could be sourced elsewhere. I think we have a lot of firms that are very competitive and are doing very well in the Chinese market.
We have about 15 minutes left. There's about 5 people, I think, stacked up ready to pose questions. So
okay.
Can we go over here?
My question is, since the PetroChina selling weapons to the Sudanese government.
Oh, can you speak a little louder?
My question is, since the PetroChina is selling weapons to the Sudanese government, those weapons are used by the Sudanese government to fight the genocide in Darfur. What is the WTO doing?
Okay. The question is on the Chinese position in Darfur and what's the role of the WTO and so forth. Well, this obviously isn't. The WTO has no role in this because it's not a trade issue. It's basically a geopolitical issue. I think that if you listen closely, you will see that the Chinese government its position on Darfur has changed. They're now supporting international sanctions and moving slowly. They haven't moved quite as far as the U.S. government wants them to move, but their position on this, I think, has been evolving in a positive direction. I think there's a long way to go, but we don't have any leverage over the Chinese on this through trade agreements, I think is quite frankly the short answer. So we've got to continue to work on the diplomatic front and to bring international pressure to bear. I think the record is, quite frankly with China, is the Chinese find it very easy to give the back of the hand to pressure that's coming unilaterally from the United States. If you can get international organizations to bring pressure to bear, the Chinese are much, much more sensitive of being found in violation of international standards or multilateral standards. So I think what we have to do is push harder in the UN. China is a member of the Security Council. It values its reputation in that body. So when it sees pressures coming from a single country, as it did, for example, on currency, it's not likely to move. On currency now, though, they're allowing their currency to appreciate much more rapidly because in recent months, the Europeans have joined in, the Mexicans, the Brazilians, even the Indians are beginning to complain about Chinese currency being undervalued. And the rate of appreciation of the currency has increased significantly over the last 2 months. So when it's pressure coming from one source, there can be a dynamic in which it doesn't get much weight when it's broader and organized, and particularly when it reflects multinational organizations. The Chinese tend to rethink their position.
My question is a general version of the gentleman across there. I was wondering, there's activists in the United States and governments in Europe that are trying to pressure China to pressure Sudan to halt the genocide there and to implement pollution controls on air and water pollution and improve labor policies. And I was wondering if you thought those efforts were going to be successful.
I can't forecast. Beyond what I've already said, I think when you see a broader front, a broader coalition of countries or major international organizations negotiating with China or bringing pressure to bear on the Chinese, they're more likely to be responsive if the Chinese perceive that it's one country trying to get them to change. There's a real problem domestically in China. The top political leadership does not want to be seen to succumbing to unilateral pressure from any country, but I think particularly when it's the United States. It's not, Hu Jintao does not want to stand up in front of the National People's Congress and say, we've changed our policy on X, Y, and Z at the insistence of the United States. It doesn't work domestically for him.
We'll go over here.
Wondering, as China is continuing to industrialize, is their average worker wage going up? Is their standard of living increasing? And if it is, does the Chinese government have any interest in trying to suppress this, given that much of their manufacturing success is due to their ability to provide such cheap labor?
The question is, what's happening as China industrializes to workers' wages and standard of living, and what's the attitude of the government? Well, the short answer is that GDP, as I mentioned, has been rising by 10% per year. Population growth is less than 1% per year. So per capita output of this economy has grown extremely rapidly, and consumption levels have gone up a lot. But because the savings rate is so high, the level of consumption, many Chinese believe, and I certainly believe, is below its potential. In the last 3 to 4 years, the government has been embarking on policies to encourage people to spend more and to save a little bit less. And one of the things they've done is they've increased provision of education. They've eliminated school fees, for example. It's strange, but the socialist China in the 50s, 60s, and right up to the very recent times charged student fees for kids to go to primary school and secondary school. So they've gotten rid of those fees, so parents don't have to save so much money to send their kids to school, and they hope they're going to spend, the government wants them to spend more instead of saving so much. So their external deficit will go down, and they'll have more balance and sustainable economic growth. So the attitude of the government actually is positive towards consumption, and that's what they've been trying to promote over the last 4 to 5 years. Households are very conservative, and as a result, they tend to have very high savings rate. China doesn't have a good pension system. China requires its citizens to pay for a very large share of their total health care costs only a small portion of the population has any decent insurance. A lot of people have kind of a sketchy, very partial insurance scheme. You still have to pay a lot of money even to get into the hospital if you're sick. So people want to have money in the bank. Chinese households, I've told you, per capita GDP is not that high. Chinese households have the US dollar equivalent of $2 trillion in bank accounts, in savings accounts, in the banking system in China, because they're saving for education, they're saving for health, and they're saving for retirement. So the short answer is the government's trying to encourage people to spend more, in part by providing more social services through government expenditures.
Over here, and then the final question will come over there.
Thank you. This has been very informative. I have two questions. The first question is the income disparity, not only between the executives and the workers, but also the executives, the college professors, engineers, mathematicians, economists, and the so-called professional class. My second question is, you mentioned think aircraft, semiconductors, and soybeans as opportunities for the United States. What do you see in the next 5 years as the major opportunities, industries and sectors that we could benefit by selling to China? For instance, defense or pharmaceuticals or whatever.
Okay, several parts to your question. On the inequality, I mean, if you go to China and, I can give you anecdotes that capture this. You go to China has auto shows and people are buying there are Ferrari dealers in China, Maserati dealers. When Bentley introduced a new model a few years ago that cost an astronomical amount, I think I figured out once, it costs 600 times the average wage. Okay, in the United States, the average household income is $45,000. So multiply that times 600. Think, what kind of car would that be? It would be a Learjet or something. And they sold more of those Bentleys in China than they did in Germany or in the US. There are a lot, there's a significant number of very rich people that have assets that are, look at the Forbes list of the 400 richest now. There are 21 Chinese billionaires on the list. There are people that have made money in property development and other areas. So the level of wealth that has been created in China is enormous, and it's very, very highly concentrated at the top, and at the bottom you have these migrant laborers that are, the average factory worker is earning about $1 a day, and a lot of these migrant laborers are earning less than that. So the contrast between rich and poor is very, very great. Now, where are the opportunities going forward? I think, as an economist, I don't really kind of go industry by industry. I just think there are enormous opportunities. This is an economy where their imports are growing by 200 and some billion dollars a year in recent years. It's very open. If you take most of the measures of ease of doing business that are developed by the World Bank and the International Financial Corporation and others, they find China is a very easy place to establish a business, to invest, or to trade. And I think lots of very small companies that weren't thinking about China 5 or 10 years ago have subsequently started to think about China, and many of them are selling products there that they didn't even know there was a market for a few years ago. So when you have very, very rapid growth of the type we've seen in China, and where you have very low tariff barriers and very little bureaucratic obstacles to selling, I think they're just endless opportunities.
Final question over here.
Taiwan.
Yep, about Taiwan. How Taiwan has all this investment in China. Does China necessarily recognize Taiwan as an economic investor in the numbers that China puts out, like according to its economic numbers that it puts out for the world to see? Does that include Taiwan, or does that separate those numbers? And what exactly are the diplomatic ties for the economy?
Okay. Well, the questions on Taiwan and again, the economic and political relations between Taiwan on the one side and China on the other. And also a question that has to do with the data. Taiwan is the biggest investor. They're probably the biggest exporter from China. And all of the economic activity that occurs in China that is carried out by foreign companies will be reflected in Chinese data, whether it's GDP or exports or employment, the wages paid will reflect all of the economic activity that occurs in China regardless of the ownership. Some of them may be still some of the state-owned companies that I mentioned before. Some of them are kind of hybrid, state, private. Some are purely private and some are foreign. All of the economic data tries to collect all of this. Now, and the same thing is also true on the export side. Now, so the two economies are very, very tightly integrated economically. You also hear these numbers. I can't remember the most recent one, that huge numbers of Taiwanese businessmen living permanently in China. It's in the millions. Taiwan only has a population of, I can't remember, 20-some million, and there's 2 million people from Taiwan living in China. So it's hard to imagine how the two economies could become more integrated. There are no obstacles to investing in the mainland if you're from Taiwan. The Taiwan government, on the other hand, still does put restrictions on investments by Chinese companies in Taiwan, and they have very restrictive trade policies. So Taiwan has an enormous surplus in its trade with China because Taiwan makes a lot of product. Taiwanese companies make a lot of products there, but they still source a lot of the parts and components in Taiwan. So there's a big trade flow from Taiwan to the mainland, but not very much coming back the other way because of restrictions that the Taiwanese government puts on the trade. So the countries are very integrated economically, but political relations are, quite frankly, in the deep freeze. Still, some people believe that in the presidential elections coming up, there will be a change in party control in Taiwan. The DPP party, which had been pushing independence, or de facto independence, or de jure independence, actually, is going to lose out. They lost badly in the legislative elections last month, and so a lot of people think that the change in domestic politics in Taiwan over the next few months will set the scene for closer ties between China and Taiwan, maybe having direct flights instead of having to go through intermediate locations, direct shipping and trade, and other things. Maybe not immediately, but the prospects for that are better now that the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, is likely to not be in power in Taiwan. So the political landscape is potentially shifting quite a bit.
With that, Dr. Nicholas Lardy.
Thank you.